It's going on YouTube.
Yes.
Be famous.
Так, а вот наш ведущий, Александр Современный.
Thanks a lot. Well then, you know, guys, the key to success is proper planning, and myself being late is a fantastic proving that it's like this. And this is why we have fantastic guests today, thanks to you, sir, thanks to our colleagues from High School of Economics and the Graduate School of Urbanism, which would be Mr. Paul Timms. It's all written there, actually. And the thing is that the key word there, I believe, is planning, isn't it?
Or else my name. But yes. Okay. Yeah.
Well, of course, the first key word is Mr. Paul Timms, and the second is planning.
Very good.
And we are very much grateful for you to come here today. And this would be your evening, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Меня тоже. Дайте мне пару слов.
I thought that you did this already. We have Ms. Yelena Koncheva here. We have Mr. Konstantin Trofimenko from the Institute for Transport Studies.
Yeah.
The same name, actually. Is the
Не совсем same.
Okay, transport economics, then.
And policy.
I do not know the English name of it. Only the Russian one.
Well, it's the same as Russian.
Oh, the same one. Then you should help us with the naming then.
Well, ну что, можно ли по-русски? Не против? Не, я могу по-английски, но просто мне так будет проще. Итак, дорогие друзья, очень рад, что мы сегодня собрались. Действительно, этой лекцией притворяется такое, в общем, достаточно плотное сотрудничество между нашим институтом и Институтом транспорта города Лица, Институт, вернее, транспортных исследований, как он правильно называется, университета города Лица. Значит, вообще, если в двух словах рассказать об этом замечательном учебном учреждении, потому что я уверен, что у Пола это не будет привязаться, то это очень авторитетный на самом деле в мире центр в области изучения транспорта. Если брать международные рейтинги, если вы не знали, существуют международные рейтинги именно отраслевые, то есть научных центров в сфере, допустим, там, энергетики, экологии, чего-нибудь еще. И вот здесь международный рейтинг отраслевых институтов в сфере транспорта. Вот в этом институте наши коллеги из лекции стабильно входят в первую десятку. Обычно там, четвертое место, то есть седьмое, что-нибудь такое требуется. Совершенно заслуженно, потому что могу сказать, что я там был, и то, что они делают, находится прямо вот на самом-самом острие транспортной науки. В общем, можно сказать, что некоторым образом они формируют тренды научные, связанные, допустим, и с глубокими социально-экономическими исследованиями предпосылок мобильности. И все, что связано, допустим, с беспилотным автомобилем в Великобритании сейчас делают коллеги. И все, что связано с действительно транспортным планированием самого глубокого уровня, опять же, понимая некоторые предпосылки и развития инфраструктуры, и мобильности людей. Вот, поэтому чрезвычайно полезно дружить с такими людьми и слушать их лекции. Ну, а вообще эта лекция, она проводится в поддержку курса «Транспортное планирование», который будет открыто в этом году в Высшей школе урбанистики. Это магистерский курс, рассчитанный на 2 года. И мы его как раз делали, может быть, по лекалам коллег из Лица. Мы их перевели на русский язык, мы их немножко адаптировали под наше образование. Вот. И я очень надеюсь, что часть коллег, в том числе и лично Пол, так или иначе, может быть, в виде каких-то онлайн-курсов, но в этом преподавании на этой магистерской программе тоже примут участие. Вот. Это такая вот была 5-минутка.
To give proper translation, your reputation in transport studies is the most impeccable.
Oh, thank you very much.
Вот, но, собственно, больше не буду вас отвлекать, потому что вы будете слушать меня. Хочу передать, I want to give a word to you, and, ну, давайте, ладно, еще все-таки 2 слова лично о Поле. Пол обладает 40-летним опытом и исследований, и транспортного планирования. Он работал в огромном количестве стран мира. Лаос, Южная Америка, Африка, Европа, то есть у него совершенно колоссальный опыт именно мирового транспортного планирования. Вот. Еще он, именно как ученый, его сфера интереса достаточно специфическое. То есть он именно что-то вроде такого философа транспорта, социально-экономические предпосылки, как раз транспортной мобильности, последствия внедрения тех или иных транспортных технологий, в том числе того, что называется цифровым транспортом. Вот это как раз то, о чем Пол пишет статьи, читает лекции своим студентам. Поэтому очень надеюсь, что вам будет интересно сегодня с ним пообщаться. Ура! Поприветствуем Пола.
Thank you. Did you say I was a philosopher?
Well, yeah.
I thought you said I like that. Yeah.
That was on your page on the list.
No, I like it. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always good to see a full room. And I've never done a lecture before in a library, even though I've travelled to all these continents. I understood that, but I've never done a lecture in a library, so this is the first time. Okay, let's get started. So, what the presentation's about? First of all, I'll be talking about the European Commission definition of sustainable transport. So this is the one that is supposed to be applied across the European Union. The European Commission, for those that are not aware, that's the civil service of the European Union. So sometimes we talk about European Union, sometimes we talk about European Commission. Then I'll be talking about what is a sustainable urban mobility plan and what is the process for a sustainable urban mobility plan. I'll then be giving some examples on sumps, and particularly research on sumps that's going on in the European Union at the moment. Then I step back a little bit to talk about the historical development of this initiative, the sumps, and in particular I'll be talking about something called the Decision Maker's Guidebook. I'll then move on to transferability issues, because this is, I think, a key part of this particular lecture, is to think about how all these ideas that are currently getting a lot of prominence in the European Union, how they might be transferred to Russia. And there are a lot of interesting research questions about transferability. And I suggest then some next steps for research in Russia upon SUMP's sustainable urban mobility plans. Okay, can everyone, first of all, can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah, if you're saying yes. When you say no, I can't hear you, then that's always a bit strange response, right? Okay, and am I speaking at the right pace? Yes. Yeah, okay. If anyone thinks I'm going too fast, sort of put your hand up, because I can always slow down. But right. Okay, so the definition, the European Commission definition of sustainable transport. This goes back to 2001, before sustainable mobility was the usual word. So this is more in the old days where we talked about sustainable transport. But as you can see, there are three main pillars of sustainable transport in this definition. There's the social, the economic, and the environmental. Why it's good to point this out is because a lot of people, if they're talking about sustainable transport, only think about the environmental. The environmental is obviously extremely important, particularly in an era of climate change and people dying of pollution and all these problems. But sustainable transport also involves a social side and an economic side, according to this definition. And the simple idea of sustainability here is that we should not be making things worse for future generations. Okay, there are various definitions. People write papers about how you define these things. But the simple idea is what we pass on to our grandchildren should be as good as what we've had, if not better. And we certainly shouldn't be making things worse for our grandchildren and for the generations after that. Now, focus on cities. Why are cities important? And this is in the EU, so we have 60% of the population, 85% of the economic activity, and I'm not going to read all these things out, but urban transport systems, there are a lot of problems to do with urban transport systems. A lot of deaths from accidents, 13,000 deaths per year. People dying from air pollution before they should be, and the conclusion to all this is that urban transport is too important to be solely the responsibility of cities. So this is why national governments and transnational organisations like the European Union need to take an interest in urban transport and not just leave everything up to cities. Having said that, and I'm not sure if anyone's aware of the word subsidiarity, but this is an important concept in the European Union, that subsidiarity means that every decisions are made on the lowest level possible. So there's always a bit of a tension here between top down and bottom up. So the idea of subsidiarity means that each city organises its own transport and tries to implement a sustainable mobility plan. On the other hand, there's something coming down from the top saying it has to be in line with principles of sustainability. And this is, I'm not going to go into details, but you can imagine this creates a lot of interesting political disputes and arguments and whatever. But there's always this tension there in the European Union between the top down and the bottom up. Okay, so what is a sustainable urban mobility plan? So it's long term and it's got a vision. This is the well, there are many important aspects to it, but maybe this is the most important. So we start off with an idea. What do we want our city to be like in the long-term future? A lot of transport planning traditionally has been done in a short-term way, so we plan for the short term. And this sustainable urban mobility plan, we're thinking about what would we like our cities, how would we like our cities to be in 2040, for example, 20 years in the future, or maybe longer. And then we sort of work backwards from that to work out a plan for now as to how to get to this long-term vision. And we have a good plan as how to get there. Another important aspect is the involvement of stakeholders and citizen participation. This is increasingly seen as being important. If plans are going to be put in which sometimes involve policies that some people don't like if you charge people more money to do something, there has to be sort of popular support. And if we get citizens to participate, we're more likely to have that popular support. And also, citizens have ideas of their own. They have innovative ideas and they can help improve the planning process. So citizen participation, extremely important. Development of all relevant modes, and the integration of our mobility, our transport measures with planning and economic policies and so on. Now, here's a little table. This goes into a little bit more detail of the sort of things that I've just been talking about. On the left-hand column, we have traditional transport planning, and on the right-hand column, we have sustainable urban mobility planning. So, on the left, we have focus on traffic, the traditional idea that transport planning was just about resolving traffic problems, and now we have a focus on people. primary objective to improve traffic flow, to speed up traffic. This is the traditional transport plan. Now we talk more about accessibility and quality of life issues. Okay, so I'm not going to read all these things out because you can read them for yourself. But I'll just pick out a couple of things. Here is the traditional transport planning. It's the domain of transport engineers. And now we want interdisciplinary planning teams. Now, I point that out because travelling around the world, as was announced at the start, it's very common. It's much more common that it happens than it doesn't happen, that transport is taught as an engineering subject. And this creates a lot of problems, because we obviously want transport engineers. We don't want to get rid of engineers, but we want other people to be involved as well. We want economists, we want people who understand about institutions, we want environmental people who know about the pollution and climate change and whatever. And we want, in general, we want interdisciplinary teams, not just to rely upon transport engineers. And just to repeat this point that I was saying before, that traditional planning is all done by experts. So the experts sitting in an office doing lots of clever planning, and then they come out with their plan and force it upon the general public. So with the sustainable urban mobility planning, we involve stakeholders, the public. Stakeholders means anyone that has a particular interest, the public, and as much as possible the whole way through. Now, what this results in, this sustainable urban mobility planning process, is something called the Sump Cycle. And there's a number of these steps that go around in a circle here, in this cycle. I'm not going to go through each step because that would be boring. So I'll just highlight what the quadrants are. So we have, up here, this is from the point of view of the city actually developing and implementing a sustainable urban mobility plan. So the first step is their preparation and analysis. What are their resources? What are they? What's their planning context? What's their situation? And then, secondly, the idea is to plan their strategy, and this is where the vision comes in that I was talking about before. What do they want for their particular city? What does the population want for the city? The third quadrant, we have what policy measures might be put in to help achieve this vision of the future. And then the final step here is actually the implementation and, importantly, the monitoring. So something's put in, and then it's important to check whether it's working or not. This might sound obvious, but it's often not done. Something's put in, and then people forget about it. This is very common. So we have to keep on monitoring, checking if our policies are working, and if they're not working, then we want to change them. Okay, so this is the Sump Cycle. Right, now there's a lot of research going on of multinational projects within the European Union on sumps. And often they produce manuals and guidelines to help city decision makers. They produce a lot of material. It's all available on the internet. It's very easy to get hold of. I've left a lot of these guidelines and documents on the table there. You're happy, I'm happy for you to take them. I don't really want to take anything back because it's a bit heavy. all these documents, and I'm an old man and my back's going. So please take, but limit yourself to one guide each. So it's not the person at the front sort of grabs them all and takes them. I mean, you think I'm joking, but I have seen it before, before people do that. So one guide each, and then, well, hopefully that'll cover all the people that want them. But they are very easy to get hold of on the internet. Now, I highlight 4 Sump manuals in particular here because they show sort of 4 of the key elements that need to be resolved when making a sustainable urban mobility plan. So, oops, I pressed the wrong button there. So we have public participation. I've already said a lot about that. Well, there's a manual on how to do the public participation, just to give advice how to do it. Clearly, every city has a history of public participation, or a history of not doing public participation, maybe. But if it's got a history of doing it, then it perhaps has a successful way of doing it, and it doesn't need to use one of these manuals. So the manuals are particularly useful there for the cities that don't have the experience. Institutional cooperation. I mean, this is very, very important with transport. It's very common in a lot of cities in the world, including in Britain, that you have one institution responsible for one mode in a city and another institution responsible for another mode. My city, Leeds, it said that they want to bring in a light rail system rather than a guided bus system. So light rail, guided bus, there are differences, but they do similar things of mass public transport. They're very keen on light rail, so it said. This is gossip, by the way, but this is what we hear. They're very keen on light rail because the city authority would have control over it because of the institutional law. If it's a guided bus, they don't have control over it because that's the law of Britain. That's the local authorities don't have control over the city's bus system. Some people find this shocking, but it's true. It's all to do with Margaret Thatcher, but we won't go any more about that. But the point being is that there's a huge institutional confusion here. I think transport is particularly subject to institutional confusion. So we need institutional cooperation, and here we've got guidelines on how to do it. Measure selection. I'll be talking a bit more about this later, but this is how we choose our policies. So we're in a city, we say we want to achieve our vision. What policy measures do we implement to choose it, and how do we go about selecting what policies? And then finally, the issue I mentioned before about the monitoring and evaluation. How do you keep monitoring the system and then evaluating it, working out whether it's successful or not? Oops. Now, as I said, there's a lot of research on sumps at the moment, and if you go to the website of a project called Cities Multimodal Project, it'll tell you, I'm just quoting now, I'm not saying this is true, I'm quoting from the website, that the first sump in Russia is in the city of Pskov. And that's the claim. Now, as I say, I'm not saying it because someone in the audience might put up their hand and say that's rubbish. There's a sump that was developed 2 years ago in wherever. You don't know what you're talking about. So I'm just quoting from the website here that claims that it's done the first sump. Now, interestingly, this is part of a multinational research project, and all these countries around the Baltic Sea are involved in this project, and different cities in these countries around, and they're doing this multinational cooperation that's very common now with European Union projects. Generally, European Union projects have a minimum of 3 countries being involved. The whole idea is to tie the whole of the European Union together. And the European Union research is open to anyone in the world. They're very proud of this idea. It's open to everyone. So it's open to Russian organizations to get involved. Constantine, you were asking me before about who was the research partner. It's the Leontiev Institute in St. Petersburg. That's the Russian researcher, and then the city authority is Pskov. But these projects are open to Russian partners, and Russian partners can join. Yeah. Okay. Now, Sump development is getting more sophisticated the whole time. It started off with an idea of a typical city, whatever that means. But now it's differentiating between different city types. So here we have 2 examples. This is a methodology for something called the polysump. So this is for cities that have multiple centres. So when we have, perhaps we might call it a region, but with multiple cities close to each other, where you need to do your transport plan for the region, and it's polycentric. This is the idea. Going the other way, we have this prosperity project that's created the resource pack for how to do the Sump approach in small cities and mid-sized cities. Now there, it's not so much because the transport is complicated in the way it is in the polycentric cities. The problem with the small cities is they don't have the resources often to do a lot of planning. So the planning department of the city might be very, very small, and it might be this small number of people have a lot of different jobs to do, and to do a full sustainable urban mobility plan might just be too much for a small city, too much for the resources. So these are suggestions on doing Sump ideas for small cities and medium-sized cities. So the point here is that the research is just going off in different directions, thinking about different city types. Now, as a result of all this research, people have concluded there are a number of barriers, there are a number of problems with implementing these plans, and go through these quickly. Now, I mentioned the institutional roles before. Then there's a lack of political commitment, so the local authority, in English you say, wants to tick the box. It wants to say that it's done something, but it's not actually really sort of enthusiastic. And when problems arise, because problems always arise in doing anything, there isn't a strong commitment to actually make the whole thing work. There might be poor integration between policy sectors, particularly with land use and transport planning. There might just not be enough funding. So you're fine to come out with a great plan that does all sorts of different things, but where does the money come from to implement it? And it just might not be there. So in my city, Leeds, I talked about this light rail, trolley bus. None of these projects have happened because there's never any funding. But it's a very, very long story, that, and I won't go into it now, but funding is vital. This limited skills option generation. So these measures that I talked about before that have to be chosen, the policy measures, there might be limited skills by the people working for the city authority in how to choose suitable measures. There might be limited public support. Once again, this reflects the whole need for public participation, involving the public as early as possible. And with new policies, new types of policies, there just might be a lack of evidence in how they work. So something that Konstantin's very keen on, for example, is about autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service, and there are lots of these sort of new policies that are being tested now. But we haven't got hard evidence about whether they work or not, or whether they have good results or bad results, or make no difference whatsoever. So, but if we're planning for the future, we have to take into account that there might be these new technologies. I mean, if you come across talk about autonomous vehicles here, in Britain it's a very fashionable thing. You switch on the television and almost every day there's some report about autonomous vehicles, particularly when they knock someone down and someone has a traffic accident, and it becomes a big thing. But the point here is that if we're talking about a plan for 20 years in the future, it might well have to involve something like autonomous vehicles because they are a fact of life. But if we don't have the evidence about what effect they have, because there are some suspicions they might actually make congestion worse for various reasons, that's a problem, lack of evidence. Okay. Right, now, as a result of all this research and these identification of barriers and the testing of these guidelines in various cities, we have a new version coming out. This is very topical now. It's actually under discussion. Here is a version that you can download from the internet. It's a draft version for discussion, actually at the moment, and you can find it from this site yourself. So this is a document. It's got lots of blank bits in it. I mean, it's still quite a long document. In fact, I've put a copy of it on the table. But it's available for people to look at and then to comment on it, and somewhere you can send your comments in if you like to do that sort of thing. Right, now what I've been talking about now is sumps, and you can think of it as like a brand name. The term sump has been around for about 5 years. And it's, as I say, it's quite fashionable at the moment for that cities ought to be doing sumps. But the actual ideas about sumps, those ones that I was talking about at the start, had that table about the engineering and going to the multidisciplinary and the linking up with land use and all these other things that I was talking about before, they haven't just come up in the last 5 years. There's been a lot of development of these ideas and a lot of research about these ideas, and I've said the last 20 years, but someone could put out their hand and say, no, you're wrong there, it's been 30 years. Okay, I'm not going to dispute that, but it's a long time. It's much more than 5 years. Now, I'm claiming that an important early contribution to this development was something called the Decision Maker's Guidebook. I'll say more about on the next slide, but it provides a simplified approach to the underlying logic of the sump process. So remember I said that this draft sump guidelines, it's quite a thick document. It's, I can't remember, 200 pages, something like that. It's going to have a lot more because there's a lot of empty space. It's quite complicated. The point about the Decision Maker's Guidebook is it's aimed at decision makers to try and make things easier for them, to help them to understand some things. Now, the Decision Maker's Guidebook, and I've brought a copy in English here, as the one you can see there. Once again, it's available on the internet. It's first published in 2003 from a European research project. And it was originally published in 6 languages: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish and Swedish, basically reflecting the partners who were involved in the project. And now it is in Russian. Last year it was translated in Russian. I have a copy here. Right? I can't give it away because it's my only copy, because I've given all my other ones away, and if I give this one away, then I'm stuck, because I can never waive this again. But it's produced by the Association of Traffic Engineers, Transport Engineers. They've translated it, and it's in Russian. And is it easy to get hold of, do you think?
Well, with a good luck.
Right, okay.
With a proper discount.
With a proper discount. You have to pay for it, do you?
I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I didn't do a search for it because...
you just need to have some... to know some guys from the station.
Right. The point being is that, I mean, because you're listening to me in English, the assumption is that you're all happy with English, and the English version you can download from that site that I put there, that www.consult.leeds.ac.uk. Okay? You saying I'm running out of time?
No.
No, I thought you...
It's about the decision makers guidebook.
Right, okay. Right, good. By the way, how am I getting on for time? I don't know. I can always overrun, so I don't want to, I was told I had to stay within 40 minutes. How much longer have I got?
It's 7:40 now.
Right?
It's
Well, we
7:40.
started late because someone was late.
Yes, because
I'm not pointing at anyone. I'm just saying someone was late.
Planning is key.
The planning, right? Okay. Well, I'll try and finish off in about 10 minutes, and then because we want to have time for discussion and questions and whatever. Okay. So the as I said before, it was always intended to be reader friendly. And one of the big innovations, it had these cartoons in it. So a lot of the things that you read, most of the things that you read on the table there, they're rather dry. They're not. It's not bedtime reading, put it like that. Whereas the Decision Maker's Guidebook had these cartoons to try and lighten it up a bit, to try and get people's interest. And an important feature was to treat transport policy formulation as a logical process. And it's this logical process here that is the heart of the DMG. Now I'm just going down the right-hand column because that's the most important one. The left-hand column is secondary. So the right-hand column, we start with the objectives, our vision, what we want the future to be like, and indicators, how we might measure that. So an obvious example is with carbon emissions. We want to reduce carbon emissions by 50%, something like that. So we have to define an indicator how we measure carbon emissions. Okay. Then we come down and we say, what are the current problems? So we have a realistic idea of what the current problems are that might stop us meeting these objectives, reaching our vision. And then we say these possible transport instruments. Sometimes the word instruments is used instead of measures. It's the same thing. What actual policies might we put in to overcome the problems and reach our objectives? We're talking about the long term, so we want to predict the impacts of these particular policies, and when we've predicted the impacts of different policies, we compare them and we see which one works best. So it's nice and simple, isn't it? I mean, I defy anyone to say, well, that's too complicated for me. If you bring in the left-hand column, it gets a bit more complicated. But the right-hand column, it's nice and easy. But it's surprising that it's often people don't think about policy in this sort of way. They start in the middle here. They sort of start thinking, well, should we have a light rail in our city? Just, out of the blue. Should we have a light rail? Well, why? I mean, if you start with your objectives because you want to achieve something, light rail might be the best way of achieving it. It might be useless, but if you don't have objectives, you can't get a handle on anything. You just sort of put something in because the other city put it in, and why shouldn't we put it in? And it might be the worst thing to do. You don't know. So you have to have this sort of logical approach. Now, moving on to transferability now, as I promised at the start. We put quite a lot of research into looking at whether the DMG in particular is able to move away from the EU. It was developed for the European Union. And we had a project, and in fact I was responsible for this project, called Sparkle. It was in Southeast Asia. So it was testing whether the decision maker's guidebook idea, and you can tell this was about 10 years ago, so we were still talking about sustainable urban transport planning. We weren't talking about mobility planning then. We were old-fashioned. But it was basically the same ideas as in a Sump. But we ran a seminar in Bangkok and did things in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, just to see how well the DMG transfers. I mean, on a very high level, the one I've just told you about, that logical process, it transfers everywhere. I mean, I can't believe there's anywhere in the world that doesn't benefit from that type of logic. The problem, though, is when you come to more detailed things about what sort of transport measures do you want, then it very much depends upon different situations. So in Southeast Asia, you have a lot of people on motorbikes, for example, so that needs to be taken into account in detailed planning. But on the high level, it's very transferable. So this brings us to the general idea about transferability of the Sump process, not just the DMG. And I say here there are many different aspects of the Sump which need to be adjusted when transferring. I think about the public participation. That's going to be an obvious one. That's bound to be different in different situations. The aspect I'm picking up on here, though, is the one about the measure selection, how you choose your particular measures, your transport measures. So I don't know if everyone's got this, what's behind this cartoon, but you've got the planner here in Venice. So he's looking out at the canals, and there's all the boats going down, and someone's given him this bicycle planning guide, and he's looking out, looking a bit perplexed. He's a bit confused as about how he might put in bicycle lanes on the canals. So it's just an example of why transferability is sometimes an issue. And this is from the decision maker's guidebook, just as I said, just to try to lighten things up. So going back, this is the guidance that I mentioned before. This is one of those 4 guidebooks I mentioned earlier on. This is the one about the measure selection, and this tells you about this, how to start thinking about these different measures, about what sort of measures you want, and importantly, how you combine measures together in packages. Because some things that you put in might be unpopular. Like road pricing, for example. People usually don't like that. And London is a famous example of this, when road pricing was put in about 15 years ago now. And the way to make it popular was to say that all the money from the road pricing went towards improving public transport and improving walking and cycling. So a lot of the population was very happy, because the money was being used for something that they liked, and that dampened down the criticism, and there was a lot of criticism from the people that didn't like the measure. Now, the idea of putting 2 policy measures together is this idea of policy packaging. So you put your unpopular measures together in a package with your popular measures and hope that it all works out okay. As I said before, the Sump developments are going off in different directions for particular audiences, and here we have example of this. We have different guidelines on measure selection for beginner cities, for people that have never developed a Sump before and who perhaps have a rather unsustainable transport system. At the other extreme, we have the very experienced, or they're called the advanced cities here, and the title of that document is Innovate, so they're already, it's the Copenhagen and the Zurich, they're on the state-of-the-art for their sustainable urban mobility, but they can still go better. So these are the guidelines for them. And then for the people in the middle who are not beginners and not experienced, you've got this step up for intermediate cities. But the point here is that you've got the different guidance for different types of cities. And so it's another example of this general trend of tailoring it for diverse cities. Right, so what types of measure might we be interested in our policies? Well, we've got these categories. We have land use measures, infrastructure measures, so road, management, how we actually use the infrastructure, information, awareness campaigns to heighten public awareness, and pricing measures. So there are different ways of categorizing measures, but this is a reasonably conventional way. Now, about transferability, we're living in an increasingly globalized world. This is the first point to make. And there's a lot of information. So when I started out in transport 30 years ago, to get information I had to go to the library in the university. And there were these old books in the library, and he might have bought 2 books in the last year. No, I'm exaggerating, but it was a bit like, they were probably older than the ones you got here, actually. But it was quite difficult to get hold of information. If you wanted particular information about a place, you had to write a letter to somebody in that city and sort of say, can you give me some information, and whatever. Okay. Now it's completely different, as you all obviously know. You just get to the internet, you tap in, Google the name of the city, whatever you want, and you've got instant information, which is great. But we have to know how to deal with all this. So we can get information overload. There can be too much. How do we sort of deal with it? And particularly with this transferability issue, we want good policies for our city. So we search around what's going on in the rest of the world. We get the information from there. We find out that something good's happening in Amsterdam, something good's happening somewhere else. But we have to think about, would that apply here? This is the key point. I mean, would it apply here? The processes of thinking about whether something from somewhere else would apply here, we call transferability analysis. Now, this is the final point I make here is not a scientific result. It's my ad hoc result by listening to people over a number of years, that if you talk about a measure from somewhere else, would it work here? You get 2 extreme responses. You get people say, yes, we want Amsterdam bicycles here. Yes, bring them in. We'll do it tomorrow. At the other extreme, people say, no, it would never work here. Never. No, never in 1,000 years would it work. Forget it. And that's very, very common, those 2 extremes. What you do with transferability analysis is probably trying to work out something in the middle. Because usually there's elements of the scheme that works well somewhere else that can be brought here, but it needs to be adapted. So it's not black and it's not white, it's grey. Okay? So, the key idea, can we devise coherent approaches to decide whether something is likely to be transferable before it actually is implemented? What's the role of evidence from very different places? If you have somewhere you think is very different, is that any relevant to us at all? Something to think about. Transferability experts. I've posed as a transferability expert, but I mean, what are these people doing? They're often criticised. I read in an academic paper once, it's these characters that travel around the world and they've got all the policies on their laptop, and they go to a city and they say, right, okay, the solution for you, I'll just look at the policies on my laptop and I'll tell you what the solution is. So, okay, that might be a little bit unfair, but I mean, it's a stereotype that does apply to some people. Anyway. Importantly, what barriers might exist to the successful transfer of measures, and on the other side, what facilitators, what things might help. Why might here be particularly open at the moment to the transfer of a particular measure from somewhere else. There's here's a site here where you've got to find out about a practical approach for the future transferability of measures, and it was written up in this article here. This is 10 years ago, and it is shown in this. Now, since we're running out of time, I won't go through all the steps one by one. I'll just summarize the particular areas. That the first set of steps is understanding what our problems are here, and then looking around for places that have solved problems. And it's still actually remarkable, I find, that I go to places and people say, "Oh, we've got a terrible problem here. We can't sort it out." And I'm often in that position where I say, "You're not actually the first city to have that problem." You know, other people have had that problem before, and some of them have found solutions. You know, probably a minority, but some of them have found solutions. It's remarkable. People, you know, say, "Oh, our problem, you know, it's terrible." So we search around, and then we create packages of measures, and then we do an assessment, an ex-ante assessment before putting them in. We do an assessment whether they work or not. We perhaps might need to adjust them after doing that assessment, and then we implement them and monitor them. So here we are. I'm saying there's two ways of doing this assessment of whether things might work. Here we have the quantitative way, and here we have someone with some complicated mathematical formula there, using models and economic techniques and whatever. And we have the qualitative way, which involves workshops and talking to people and whatever. I mean, if the resources are available, it's good to do both. The point is, going back to this idea about the small city, remember I was talking about the small city without the resources, they often are not in a position to do any quantitative assessment anyway, even if they wanted to do it, so they can only do the qualitative assessment. But there are these two ways of doing things. So the qualitative assessment, a useful tool with this is this barrier analysis, where we go through a number of categories of possible types of barriers and think about whether they would apply to the transfer of a measure to here. So first one, financial. Can we afford it? Might be too expensive. Physical. An example of that was from the Venice example. But other examples of, if you have a mountainous area, then probably ordinary pedal cycles might be a bit of a problem. So we adjust things, we think of electric bicycles or something like that. So it's this whole process of adjustment. Technological, there might be some sorts of technological reasons why a particular measure doesn't work in our particular place. Cultural, that's a very interesting one. People often say it's not our culture to do certain things. Now, can spend a lot of time talking about this. The important point is that cultures change. Historically, if we look at history, we see that cultures do change. And what do I mean by culture? People's attitudes. People's attitudes towards something. If we look at the evidence from history, they do change. So if people say, it would never work here. So, let's say, example I used yesterday. So Moscow is the #1 cyclist capital of the world in 20 years' time. Right, so you start laughing. It's not our culture. Right, okay. It might not be the most likely things, but things can change. I mean, in other cities, we look at Netherlands and we think everyone's born with a bicycle, riding a bicycle as a baby, but it wasn't always like that. Back in the early 70s, the number of bicycles went really low. and then it's built up again after that. So culture is variable. Political, this is the issue that some people might actually get a disbenefit from a measure, and we have to think about that. Packages, as I said before. Legal, there might be legal problems doing something. And security, so some measures are just work fine in some way, they're just dangerous somewhere else. Right, so this is I'm coming to the end now. This is the suggestions for potential research in Russia. Now, the point here is I'm separating theory from practice, because it's very important to do so when we talk about planning. So the first question is, in what ways is the Sump approach in theory different to the theoretical urban planning approaches in Russia now and in the past? So that's on the theoretical level. And it might turn out that there'll be differences, but perhaps they're not too big differences. It's a subject for research anyway. The second point is in practice, because it's all very well having these big theories, but when they get applied in practice, they're often different to the theory. And so in what ways is a Sump approach, as currently practiced in the EU, different to actual urban planning approaches in Russia? Okay? And then putting these two things together, we can answer this question: how transferable is the Sump approach as something currently practiced in the EU involving all these projects and all these different examples? Is that transferable to Russia? So it's an interesting research question. How we'd organise it, there's lots of different ways of going about this. One suggestion, though, is to start with those 4 guidebooks I mentioned before, the 4 themes: public participation, institutional cooperation, measure selection, monitoring, evaluation, and pursue the research along these 4 distinct lines. We could have lots of case studies of Russian cities of all different types. Polycentric, actually in Moscow, it fits with the polycentric idea, to very small cities. And finally, it's the point I've already made, but I emphasise again, Russian cities researchers are very welcome to participate in EU research programmes. Okay? And that's the end.
Друзья, если кому-то из вас нужен микрофон, чтобы задать вопрос, он лежит здесь. И I would aid with interpreting if you need this, of course, for your questions. Константин.
Ну или просто будьте громкими. И не стесняйтесь.
Прошу вас. И будьте любезны, пожалуйста, представляйтесь. I would be aiding and interpreting for those who have some difficulties with it.
Totally, yes. Yes.
Меня зовут Рашид, системный аналитик первой грузовой компании. Такой вопрос, 2 вопроса есть. Первый, когда учитывают тренды появления автономных средств транспортных при планировании городских автобусных маршрутов, прогнозируют ли, что они станут в таком случае круглосуточными?
What autonomous vehicles?
А круглосуточными будут кто?
Автобусы.
The buses.
The buses.
Но если они станут автономными, водитель не
If
должен
buses
отдыхать и
would become autonomous.
Oh, the buses become autonomous. Yes. Well, I mean, the whole point about autonomous transport is there are a lot of location-specific factors. Now, one issue about automation in general is a lot of people will lose their jobs. Yeah? That's automation in general. Now, in some societies, that is not a problem because there are other jobs for people to do. Other societies, there's a potential problem. Now, I can't say where Russia fits with that. but it's certainly a factor that has to be taken into account when we're coming out with our vision. Does that help answer the question?
Так, я имел в виду, планируют ли они движение, что автобус будет круглосуточно ездить, и как от этого экономика транспорта?
Do you plan for the 24/7 service for these buses and how this would impact the economy, the urban economy?
Right. I think the key point about the sustainable urban mobility planning idea is that people are central and they have demands for accessibility. So the simple answer to the question, if people want to be moving around in the night, then they should have buses to move them. If people don't want to move, if people don't want to travel at night, we have a small town where everyone wants to be in bed by 11 o'clock, then you don't have night buses. But if you have a demand for transport, then I think you have to have night buses. I arrived at Moscow Airport, Sheremetova, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:30, I think, something like that. I got a taxi that brought me to my hotel in the centre, and there was a traffic jam. You know, I find it amazing, actually. You know, we were stuck in traffic at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, so there's a demand, and if there's a demand, then there should be a public transport service for it. Now, the question is who pays for public transport, which is not something that I got into, but generally, if we want a certain sort of sustainable future, it usually means that we have to subsidise public transport. We have to pay for it because it won't pay for itself. That's based upon evidence from many places. There are a small number of examples of places in the world where public transport pays for itself without subsidy. It's very special locations, like Hong Kong, for example. It's very dense. You know, it works, but in general, public transport needs to be subsidised to achieve our vision. This is the whole point about saying our vision first, and then working out how to achieve it.
Я можно поясню сначала ситуацию. Ну, совершенно ясно, что в крупных городах средний путь от работы до дома это больше 100 километров. В Нью-Йорке, например, это 200. И понятно, что чтобы эффективно и как бы чтобы жизнь человека не превращалась в тюрьму, то есть путь до работы должен быть безостановочным. Это должен быть общественный транспорт, потому что частный транспорт в случае аварии переграждает весь путь. И, ну, скажем, совершенно ясно, что очевидно назрела, то есть необходимость легких навесных путей, потому что как бы пути, поднятые над землей, очень дорогие, но там есть возможность совершенно настолько дешевых путей, насколько это, например, линия электропередач. И в случае их облегчения, то есть вот если какие-то проекты, ну, и этот путь должен быть безостановочный, то есть от крыльца до работы. Только в таком случае сегодняшние крупные города могут как-то вот, эффективно функционировать. Вот эта необходимость совершенно назрела и жестоко назрела. А как бы никаких решений ни в московском правительстве, ни, например, тоже в Нью-Йорке не предвидится. То есть человек по-прежнему по 3 часа мучается на работе, с работы и на работу. То есть вот что известно в этом смысле вот на Западе, есть ли какие-то продвижения?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think the first point to make, and I mentioned a couple of times about linking up transport planning with land use planning.
А можно перевести?
Сейчас подойду.
А можно на всю толпу, может быть?
Как мы поступим? Okay, I would be talking after you, sir.
Right. Okay.
Phrase by phrase.
So the first point to make is that we always want to link up our transport planning with our land use planning.
Первый пункт, который я хочу здесь отметить, это то, что транспортное планирование должно быть увязано с планированием землепользования.
Now, in particular, we want the destinations of people to be as close as possible to where they live.
Конкретнее здесь мы говорим о том, что место, куда едут, должно быть как можно ближе к тому месту, откуда они едут.
So this
Где они живут.
So this reduces a lot of the need for travel.
И таким образом мы можем убрать причину того, чтобы нужно куда было бы ехать.
Okay, I think this is the first point, that we want to reduce the amount of travel.
То есть первое, о чем я здесь хочу сказать, что мы должны говорить о снижении транспортной работы.
The second point, though, is if we do have big flows of people actually demanding to travel, then public transport is a more efficient use of space than car transport.
Во-вторых, если мы говорим о потоках, о пассажиронапряженных потоках, то очевидно, что общественный транспорт более эффективен, чем другой.
So if we have the demand for people, even in spite of our land use plans, we still have big flows of people, we have to have public transport solutions.
Вне зависимости от землепользования, нам все равно нужно будет приходиться этих пассажиров перемещать.
Because if people are using their cars, particularly single occupancy cars, it's a bad use of space.
Потому что если речь идет об индивидуальном автотранспорте, особенно когда в автомобиле находится один человек, естественно, это неэффективное использование земли.
So we reach the conclusion we just have to build whatever is required for public transport.
То есть из этого мы приходим к выводу о том, что нам нужно построить именно то, что нужно для общественного, никакого ни было иного вида транспорта.
But I do come back to that original point that if we can provide facilities for people close to their home, so their work, their shops, their whatever they want to go to, it's close, that will reduce the need to travel.
Но я опять-таки вернусь к первоначальному тезису о том, что если мы настраиваем землепользование таким образом, что у людей есть те места, куда они едут рядом с их домами, они будут ездить меньше.
And there's a long history of satellite cities that have been created to having cities outside the main city, which are supposed to be self-contained.
Существует долгая история так называемых спутниковых или сателлитных городов, где как раз это и происходит. Они замкнуты в себе.
But they're often not successful.
Но это не всегда успешные примеры.
So people living in the satellite cities commute to work in the main city, and the satellite cities create more problems.
Люди, живущие в городах-спутниках, ежедневно ездят на работу в центральный город, и это лишь создает дополнительные проблемы.
So it's a complicated problem, but our land use planning has to be very good.
Это говорит о том, что это непростая проблема, и говорит о том, что именно наше землепользование, our land use should be...
Our land use planning has to be very good to get over that problem that I'm
Наше
saying.
землепользование должно очень хорошо планироваться для того, чтобы именно это и преодолеть.
Ну, можно я немножко возражу, но Москва это город наполовину научный, и просто доказано, что половина длинных перевозок осуществляют именно люди науки, и там конструкторские всевозможные КП, их огромное количество, это порядка 1 миллиона рабочих мест. И вот, например, инструкторного дела мы не можем распылить по всей Москве, там, в виде мелких лабораторий, это невозможно. То есть существующую ситуацию в Москве не преодолеть.
And this
То есть
means that we
обязательно нужны вот эти
cannot
легкие
overturn
надземные
this
перестановочные
method.
пути.
And I
Вместо
stress the
этого
need
занимаются
of a
тяжелым
second
метро
story
и усовершенствуют личный транспорт
being
за огромные
overground
деньги.
or
И вот это противоречие просто поражает.
If it's necessary, it's necessary.
Но если нужно, значит нужно.
It's, I think that's the simple.
Добрый день, меня зовут Анна, я архитектор, я работаю в Институте Москвы, вот, и меня интересует взаимосвязь землепользования, но не части использования.
Говорите громче, пожалуйста, вас не слышно.
Не части вида использования, а в части предельных параметров, допустим, плотности застройки, взаимосвязи и транспортной доступности. Вот. Я занималась этим в своей магистерской диссертации, то есть я разработала модель, которая изменяет максимальную плотность застройки в зависимости от транспортной доступности. Вот. Я знаю, что какая-то похожая система есть в Лондоне, которая устанавливает уровень доступности на общественном транспорте и точно так же максимальную плотность застройки. Может быть, вы мне посоветуете еще какие-то кейсы, которые я могла бы рассмотреть и которые мне были бы интересны в контексте
notable examples of this type of modeling and this type of correlation. Thank you.
Well,
It is a dialogue.
yeah, there's modelling, and then there's. I don't want to talk about modelling to start with. I'll talk about something else, about density, and then I'll.
Я сначала про плотность, а потом уже про модели с этим связанные.
But with density, I mean, for me, a key point is verticalization.
Вам не продолжать?
Yeah, a key point is verticalization, because the more high everything is, the more dense.
Ключевая мысль здесь состоит в том, насколько высоко идет наша застройка.
Now, I think all our countries have seen a lot of problems with verticalization.
Все наши страны столкнулись с проблемами вертикальности застройки.
But for me, it's a very interesting issue because in Britain, big tower blocks are generally seen to be bad housing.
Меня интересует этот вопрос, потому что, например, в Англии кварталы, составленные из высоко вертикально застроенных домов, теперь считаются плохим видом застройки.
But when I lived in Brazil, the city I lived in, the big tower blocks were the expensive housing.
А когда я жил в Бразилии, было наоборот, что подобные кварталы из высоко вертикально застроенных домов были хорошей застройкой.
And it was a totally different mindset.
Это был абсолютно иной подход в головах.
So I think that there's a lot of interesting research to be done in height and density about how you provide good housing that people want.
Поэтому я говорю здесь о том, что здесь много нужно исследовать о том, как вертикальность застройки влияет на плотность.
But the point, and it goes back to the point before about the facilities have to be close.
Увязывая это с тем, что я сказал с ответом предыдущего, по предыдущему вопросу, мы должны это увязывать с тем. Can you repeat the last phrase, please?
But the facilities need to be close.
Мы должны это увязывать с тем, что то, что нужно живущему человеку, должно быть недалеко от того, где он живет.
So I'm not an expert on Russia at all, but what I have read is that a lot of high-rise blocks that were built next to factories, and so that reduced transport.
Я не эксперт по России, но из того, что я читал по этому вопросу, я знаю, что большая высокоэтажная застройка жилая застраивали высокоэтажными жилыми домами рядом с местами промышленного приложения труда.
But with deindustrialization, the factories closed, and that created huge traffic flows for the city. But I'm not an expert.
Но в процессе деиндустриализации, когда эти самые заводы закрывались,
это создавало большую транспортную нагрузку как раз из этих жителей, этих вертикально застроенных жилых домов. Но я не эксперт по России.
Just, I think the other part of the question was about models.
Если я правильно запомнил, ваша, собственно, вторая часть вопроса касалась того, как это смоделировать можно.
Того, как связана, в принципе, плотность застройки и транспортная доступность.
How we correlate the density of land use to the transport availability, and how we can find this correlation.
Я знаю, что в Лондоне, у них, когда увеличивается транспортная доступность на общественном транспорте, у них вносят изменения и увеличивается плотность, допустимая плотность.
Then you, after that, you can increase the density of the use of this exact place.
Yes, I mean the key point is that we're concerned about people, and we want to know what the demand is.
Да, именно так. У нас мы думаем о людях, и поэтому нам важно, какой транспортный спрос они предъявляют.
Now we know in many places there's a suppressed demand.
И мы знаем, что в ряде мест есть искусственно ограниченный спрос.
And that's why often increasing the transport supply can increase the demand, because
И поэтому, когда мы увеличиваем транспортное предложение, вслед за этим увеличивается и транспортный спрос. Там же.
Because the demand was suppressed.
Потому что этот спрос был занижен.
If the demand wasn't suppressed, then we increase the transport supply, and there wouldn't be any more travellers because no one would use it.
Если этот транспортный спрос не занижен, то увеличивая и транспортное предложение, а спрос за ним не пойдет.
So the idea with sustainable mobility is that we don't suppress travel, but we might suppress car travel.
Идея sustainable mobility состоит в том, что мы не спрос занижаем, а занижаем спрос на перемещение на собственном автомобиле.
So the most sustainable modes are walking and cycling, and we want people to do that as much as possible. We don't want any suppression.
И в тех видах транспорта, которые самые sustainable, я не знаю, как это переводится, неустойчивые точно. В тех видах транспорта, которые самые sustainable, которые пешком и на велосипеде, can you repeat the last thing, please?
Well,
Not cycling and
cycling and walking, because they're the most sustainable. We don't want any trip suppression.
Поскольку они самые sustainable, мы не хотим никакого занижения спроса. Ну, допустим.
So if people want to walk and cycle, they should be, it should be safe, comfortable to do so for as much as they want.
И поэтому они должны быть, эти виды перемещения должны быть безопасными, комфортными, ровно в том объеме, который является спросом.
At the other extreme with car trips, we do want to suppress car trips.
Совершенно с другой стороны спектра мы хотим максимально занизить спрос на перемещение на машине.
And public transport sort of somewhere in the middle between the two
все виды
extremes.
общественного транспорта, они болтаются где-то посередине. Константин, Елена, вам решать.
Ну, давайте все-таки дойдем возможность к другому.
Yeah, let's make it a question by question, not engage into discussions. Да, я вижу. Молодой человек в белом. Будьте любезны, представляйтесь.
Да, добрый день. Добрый день, Саша. Добрый день.
Здравствуйте, Илья.
Друзья, меня зовут Илья, я транспортный консультант. Я могу задать вопрос по-английски и сам себя привести?
Да, пожалуйста, если you can ask the question yourself and interpret it
I
to
will give
Russian.
Alexander a bit of rest, and I will ask a question in English, and then I will translate myself for everybody else who doesn't speak English as much as.
I think everyone understands English. I hope so. If there's some people who've been suffering for an hour not understanding.
Okay. So my name is Ilya. I'm a mobility consultant. I work here in Moscow, and thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to, in continuation of what you were just mentioning, I wanted to ask a very particular and practical question. in various planning processes in Moscow, in which I'm also involved, this or the other way, we occasionally face, like basically from every project to every other project, we face one and the same situation, that we have discussions about mobility and how to provide transportation to new developments. You know, maybe you know that we have many in Moscow and many even in the city center. And so we are in these discussions, and every single time I'm in this discussion, I end up in a room full of people, and there are some people providing a traffic report. And they're saying that, you know, we don't have enough road capacity, so we cannot have here like 4 lanes, so we need 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or what you might call it lanes, because we need capacity in order to avoid, you know, any troubles with traffic, any queuing or any traffic jams or whatever. And sometimes when I hear that kind of thing, I just stand up and I say, you know, guys, but what about, you know, sustainable streets? What about cycling? What about walking? How about, you know, transport demand management, reducing the amount of lanes, or what about the induced demand that is caused by, you know, more roads and so on and so forth. And every time I try to say any of these things or all these things together, I feel like I'm the only idiot in the room. Because everybody says, you know, we did a lot of traffic modeling, and we have a 400 pages traffic modeling report, and we did the simulation, and we see that, you know, in order to sustain the travel demand that is caused by this new development, we need at least 12 lanes of road. So my question is very practical. How do we eventually escape these kinds of conversations in city planning, in transport planning, and eventually turn ourselves into what the rest of the world seems to be doing right now? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I mean,
You wanted to translate yourself.
I think everyone understands it.
Everyone understands.
I think you speak more clearly than I do. If they don't understand you, then...
Yeah, if there's a need, нужно перевести, да? Я переведу тогда вопрос. Меня зовут Илья.
Ты чувствуешь себя идиотом.
Да, меня зовут Илья, я чувствую себя идиотом. Я транспортный консультант, и часто в работе над разными проектами, в Москве их очень много, я каждый раз оказываюсь в тот или иной момент времени в комнате, где сидит много людей, и обсуждается, как обеспечить транспортную доступность для того или иного объекта, и каждый раз эта дискуссия в конечном итоге доходит до того, что, значит, нам нужно добавить еще там 4, 6, 8 полос дорожного движения, потому что иначе у нас будут пробки, у нас будет очередь, у нас будет коллапс, и для того, чтобы значит, решить проблему пробок, нам нужно добавить больше полос. И каждый раз я пытаюсь вставать в эту дискуссию и говорить, ребята, как же там устойчивое развитие, как же там управление транспортным спросом, индуцированный спрос, там велодорожки, пешеходы, и каждый раз я чувствую, что на меня все смотрят, как будто я просто клинический идиот в этой комнате. И встают какие-то люди и говорят, вы знаете, мы сделали транспортное моделирование, у нас отчет на 400 страниц, мы моделировали разные сценарии, и, безусловно, для того, чтобы побороть пробки, нам здесь нужно не менее 12 полос. И вопрос в том, как выйти из этого рода бесед в городском планировочном процессе, и как поменять парадигму, и как наконец перейти к тому, чтобы обсуждать те вещи, которые обсуждаются везде в мире за пределами нашей страны.
Okay, so if I answer this, I sympathise with the situation. I've been in that situation many times myself. My way of dealing with it in the short term is to respond as an engineer. And I respond by saying, is everyone familiar with the idea of passenger car units? It's the idea that you have different modes of transport, and you say you take a bus, and you say, how many cars is that equivalent to in terms of use of road space? So
все знакомы с концептом passenger car unit переводится как условный автомобиль, то есть некое количество человеков X в одном автомобиле.
But who are you translating for?
You.
Because he understands.
Okay, whatever.
I mean, you're translating for the other. But no, I just think we could get more questions in.
Okay.
But the point about the passenger car unit is it's an engineering concept, and as I say, a bus is typically seen as 2.5 cars. It uses the space of 2.5 cars, whereas it carries 60 people. whereas a bus might be 1.5 people, 1 or 2 people. Okay. So just from an engineering point of view, forget about all the sustainability and all these other things. From an engineering point of view, low occupancy cars are the worst use of road space. They are inefficient use of road space. And so from an engineering point of view, you know, I say, you know, I'm an engineer. I have actually got a PhD that says engineer. I never actually understood a lot of engineering, but it says on the title it's engineer. So engineer to engineer.
I don't have one yet.
Yes.
Not a PhD.
But from an engineer to an engineer, I'm saying, you know, when I'm in that situation with the people that you're talking about, with engineer to engineer, let's talk about passenger car units. And what you need to be doing is planning your road space for the most efficient mode that can use it. So the idea of building 12-lane highways for single occupancy cars is ridiculous. It's just crazy. And that's independent of anything to do with sustainable transport, climate change, or any of these other issues. It's a pure logical engineering approach. So I sort of get people over onto that, and then I can start talking about the sort of the other things later on, the sustainable transport later on. But it's, yeah, passenger car units. It's what with students. You know, I start by I don't know if anyone's ever seen this, but people have created pictures of, and what you get is, you get on the left, you get 60 people using cars. You get a photo of 60 cars on the street. And then in the middle you get 60 people using a bus. So you get one bus on the street. And here you have a photo of 60 people walking. So 60 humans sitting. And then you compare, you know, the use of space. And the car travel is just inefficient.
Ilya was the one to create this picture.
No,
Did you?
One of the pictures.
I used it in my presentation, but I wasn't the creator.
About the shape vehicles. Sorry.
It's quite common. There's a number of variations. Some with photos, some with cartoons, some with But that's and I find engineers do understand that. But I've had that. I mean, the extreme I had was in. I don't know if I should say the city. It was in Southeast Asia. It was a city in Southeast Asia. And I was talking with a transport planner for the city government that said we're going to ban buses in the centre because they use a lot of space.
Yeah, right.
But wait, just think about that. I mean, it's so shocking, the idea of banning a bus because it uses a lot of space. I mean, it's horrific because the roads were congested, and if you'd put 60 people into a bus, they would have become less congested. And I pointed this all out, and I went through it, and he said, "Oh, right, we won't ban them then." But you know, it's quite basic. Yeah. Is there any more questions? Yeah, you've been trying for a while.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Alexander, and I work with Konstantin at the Institute. So I think for me it's very interesting to talk about the limitation of transport planning, as your presentation was mostly about a sort of advanced, or let's say smart type of planning nowadays. But I'd like to ask you, what limitations do you think the transport planning have nowadays? I'd like to say a few examples. For example, politicians tend to build very expensive transport infrastructure, like motorways, like tramways or metro, for example. But these systems make too expensive for the public. Also, for example, sometimes systems, transport systems that are not planned by any kind of authorities, for example, informal transport in Africa, works better than any systems that could be planned in these circumstances. Also, we've seen a few years ago in developed countries that the open market have introduced some kinds of transport systems like Uber and other systems of this kind, and politicians and planners, they try to defend their traditional taxi industry or public transport industry and try to ban these new systems. What is your opinion about these examples, and do you think we need to maybe stop transport planning at some line and to give some questions to maybe autonomous or to market maybe, and so on?
Okay. In general, Britain was one of the first neoliberal economies. In terms of city transport, it's got a very extreme neoliberal logic that the bus service is completely deregulated as well as being privatised. So that's different to continental Europe, where you have privatisation, but the standards are set by the city, and where you have tenders for to provide transport services, and private firms bid to run particular predefined services. In Britain, apart from London was protected, which was interesting, but in Leeds, you and I could buy a bus and start running it as a service next week, as long as it meets safety standards. Okay. Now, we've had this experiment, and I think we can safely say it doesn't work. There's a lot of problems with it. What it is, you get reasonably good service on high flow corridors, very bad service on lower flow corridors, because all the buses want to chase the passengers. That has an effect on pushing people into cars who, and it's. So I think as an experiment, it hasn't worked. So this free-for-all neoliberal hasn't worked. The whole system has to be planned. Now, if there is going to be privatisation, then okay, that has to be in a context where it's the city actually defines the service level, the frequency, the fares, and all these things. And so the private sector is only responsible for the operation. Is that the case in Moscow at the moment? Yeah. So you're ahead of us. I mean, in Leeds, we dream of having something like this because we haven't got it. Only London is protected, because I think it's such a big city that they didn't want to create chaos in the capital city. So once you get into that mindset that something needs to be planned, yes, there will be lots of problems, and that's why there's lots of work for transport researchers, mobility researchers, because we have to work out how to deal with the problems. And all the problems that you said are problems that do exist in the real world. I just want to come back to the point about the informal transport, or that you said the African system. I think that's very, very interesting. And in fact, I've given lectures in Africa, and I've sort of said this, that actually you do some things in a more advanced way than we do. Yeah, I mean, it's a complex issue, but we have to remember that safety is a very important thing. I mean, one of the big problems about a lot of informal transport systems is they can be quite efficient in terms of road space and providing a service, but they can be quite unsafe. So, for Africa, motorcycle taxis, which there's quite a lot going for them. I mean, there's very high accident rates, and that needs to be resolved. But
At this point, we end the questions and answers session, and you are free to ask your questions in private. That's why we're here. And we will be able to assist you if you face troubles with English or interpreting or something like that.
And the guidebooks, don't forget the guidebooks. One per person. And that,
Да,
please don't fight over them.
Вот лежат на столике. And for now, let's say thank you to our lecturer.
Okay, so please take the guidebooks.
Академический руководитель
I don't want
программы
to take them home.
Лучше находится вот здесь, вот рядом со столиком. Пожалуйста, задавайте свои вопросы. И у нас есть академический руководитель еще и другой программы по транспортному планированию.
Is he? He's giving me a lift. Oh, how nice.
We'll meet tomorrow at 11.
11. Right, okay. At the cafe.
Hello, my name is Pola, and I very interested. But I have a simple question. Yes or no? You now in